The soft glow of the moon filtered through the windows of their shared apartment, casting long shadows across the room. Taehyung sat at the edge of the bed, fingers loosely gripping a glass of whiskey. The ice clinked softly as he raised the glass to his lips. The burn of alcohol doing nothing to ease the weight pressing down on his chest. Wine was sitting on the opposite side. Her knees pulled to her chest as she watched him in silence. She could feel the emotional distance between them more acutely than ever tonight. It had been this way for as long as she could remember, though she'd never had the courage to confront him fully. She knew his heart had belonged to someone else before her, but he had never shared the depth of that pain. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the floor, his thoughts seemingly far away. It was always like this. A wall between them that she could never quite tear down. She had tried to be patient, understanding. She loved him, after all. She loved him so much that the silences, the coldness, the distance, it all hurt, but she swallowed it because he was worth it. We've been together for years now, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. Do you ever think about our future? There it was, the question she had been holding back for so long, finally laid bare between them. She didn't expect a grand romantic gesture, but she needed something. Some sign that she wasn't just a placeholder for a ghost from his past. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his response. Taehyung finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment the silence was unbearable, and then he sighed, placing the glass down on the nightstand. His voice was low, almost tired when he spoke. We have time, Ryan, he said, running a hand through his tousled hair. There's no need to rush into something like that. It was the same answer he had given her before. Each time she had gently hinted at wanting more, at wanting something permanent. It was a practiced excuse, one that allowed him to keep her at arm's length without having to commit fully. And she knew in the pit of her stomach that this was less about time and more about the fact that he wasn't ready to let her in. Not really, not the way she had hoped. Van forced a small smile, though her heart was breaking. Okay, she whispered, I understand, but she really didn't. Not really. How could she, when all she wanted was to be with him completely? And he continued to keep her on the outside of his heart. Taehyung nodded, seeming relieved by her response. He leaned back against the headboard, closing his eyes as though the conversation had exhausted him. She watched him, feeling the familiar sting of tears swelling up, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry, not again, not over this. It wasn't as though she didn't know about his past. His ex had been the love of his life, a relationship so intense and all consuming that it had burned him to the core. She had left him not by choice, but because her family had forced her to. Taehyung had never quite recovered from that heartbreak. He carried it with him like a shadow, and no matter how much time passed, it seemed to linger, haunting everything between them. Van had always known she would never be able to fill the void his ex had left behind. She wasn't the same, and he didn't love her with the same fire. He was cold, distant, sometimes kind, but never warm enough to thaw the ice that had built up between them. She lay down beside him, close but not touching, staring up at the ceiling. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. She wondered if he even noticed how much his indifference hurt her, or if he was too wrapped up in his own pain to care. Maybe both. Taehyung opened his eyes again, sensing her unease, but instead of speaking, he reached over and turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Good night, he mumbled, turning onto his side, his back facing her. One swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. Good night, she replied softly, her voice barely audible. She lay in the dark, her mind racing. She had been understanding, always understanding, but how much longer could she pretend that this was enough? How much longer could she keep quiet about the loneliness that gnawed at her every time he shut her out? It wasn't just about marriage, it was about the future, about a life she wanted to build with him, but he couldn't seem to see her the way she needed to be seen. She was tired of waiting for him to love her the way she deserved, tired of pretending that his coldness didn't hurt. But still she stayed because she loved him. The sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow on the bed as early morning light filtered in. Wine stayed first, blinking against the brightness before slowly turning over to face Taehyung. He was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. His face, always so sharp and distant during the day, looked softer in the morning light. She studied him for a moment, taking in the rare sight of him looking so serene. Despite everything, despite the distance that seemed to pull them apart each night, There were still moments like this, moments where she could almost convince herself that he loved her as much as she loved him. She reached out tentatively, brushing a few strands of hair away from his face, his fingers barely grazing his skin. Taehyung stared, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked a few times, his expression sleepy as he looked at her. For a brief moment, a warm, soft smile crossed his lips, a smile that made Vian's heart skip a beat. It was these fleeting moments that kept her hanging on, hoping for more. Good morning, he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. Morning, she whispered back, a smile tugging at her own lips. For a few seconds it felt easy, natural even. She could almost forget about the emotional barriers he kept between them. Ryan hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind again. He let out a long sigh but didn't look away. Instead, he shifted in the bed, propping himself up on one elbow as he gazed at her. His expression was unreadable, but he reached out, resting his hand lightly on hers. Maybe she could believe him, even if only for a little while longer. She smiled softly, squeezing his hand. Okay, she whispered, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. Taehyung closed his eyes at the touch, a quiet exhale escaping him. He let the moment linger, the warmth between them enough to push the thoughts of his past into the background. For now. As he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer, they shared a quiet peace that felt almost normal. The day passed like any other. They both went to their respective jobs, the buzz of the city around them becoming just background noise. Taehyung worked at his office, though his mind often wandered back to Ryan. Maybe things weren't perfect, but there was a part of him that wanted to believe he could make it work with her. She was patient, understanding, more than he probably deserved. Around noon, while working, he overheard someone in the office talking about an earthquake alert. Did you hear there's been talk of a possible earthquake in the city later today? A co worker remarked, casually sipping coffee. But it's probably nothing. You know how these warnings go. Taehyung only half listened, feeling it away in the back of his mind. It seemed like a distant concern, not something he needed to worry about. Earthquake rumors were always floating around in a city like this, and rarely did anything serious happen. By 5 p.m., both he and Ryan were back from their offices, arriving together at their apartment building. The street outside was alive with the usual hum of evening life. People walking their dogs, chatting on their phones, and the occasional sound of children playing in the distance. As they walked toward the entrance of their building, the familiar weight of the day's work began to ease. The elevator ride to the fourth floor was quiet but not uncomfortable. Ryan leaned against the wall, her hand brushing his briefly. She quickly took it away, muttering a soft sorry. He glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips as he reached out to intertwine with hers. She was shocked at first, but then smiled. Despite everything, moments like these made it feel like they could figure things out. When they reached the fourth floor, Taehyung pulled out his keys, walking towards the door of their apartment. He was about to unlock it when he heard a voice that made him freeze in his tracks. It was soft, familiar, unmistakable. His heart stopped for a second as the words floated towards him from the end of the hallway. It wasn't just the voice, it was the tone, the melody of it that was so deeply ingrained in his memory. His ex. He stood there, paralyzed, as the voice continued closer now. She was talking on the phone, her words casual but carrying a weight that hit him like a freight train. I'm fine, really, she was saying, her hand resting on her slightly protruding belly. Taehyung's stomach dropped. He felt Wine's presence beside him, felt her growing still as she too registered the voice. He couldn't bring himself to turn around, couldn't bring himself to face what he already knew was standing behind him. The seconds felt like hours, his hand gripping the door handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He heard the familiar soft laugh, her laugh, and then the sound of footsteps as she passed by them, completely unaware of their presence. When she finally walked out of sight, Taehyung's world seemed to tilt. His ex, the woman he had loved to death, was pregnant. She had moved on, built a life, and he hadn't even known. He stood there in stunned silence, his mind whirling. He could barely breathe, barely think. as the weight of her presence in the building in his life once again crashed down on him. Her voice still echoed in his ears, her soft laugh, the casual way she had talked about the baby. It was surreal, like a dream, or rather a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Beside him, Vine was quiet. She hadn't said a word since they had heard the voice, but he could feel the tension radiating off her. She had always known about his past, about his ex, but this was different. This was real and right here, right now. He could feel her eyes on him, silently waiting for him to say something, but his throat was tight and his heart was racing too fast. He couldn't, not now. He wasn't ready to face this, to face her. Taehyung finally muttered, unlocking the door and pushing it open. Wan followed him in, her movements slow, as if she was still processing what just happened. Once they were inside the apartment, the silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Of water, but his hand was shaking, and he barely managed to take a sip before setting it down on the counter with a loud clink. Vine watched him from the living room, her eyes filled with worry and something else he couldn't quite place. He knew she was waiting for him to explain, to tell her how he was feeling. But all he could do was pretend like it hadn't happened. He wasn't ready to confront the storm brewing inside him. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on the floor. I know you saw her, but let's not talk about it right now, please, he said quietly. Wan's face fell slightly, but she nodded, biting her lip. Okay, she whispered, then stayed silent. The tension between them, the weight of the past and the present colliding, hung in the air like a dark cloud. Taehyung tried to focus on anything but his ex, but it was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, heard her voice. He had to push it away. He had to ignore it. There was no room for the past in his life now, not with Wyan here, waiting for him to choose her fully. But no matter how hard he tried, the pull of his ex's presence was like a wound that refused to heal. It was later in the evening when the first remorse hit. Taehyung and Wyan had been sitting in the living room, the television on, but neither of them really paying attention. At first, it was subtle, a light shaking of the floor beneath them. They both glanced at each other, confused, but it passed so quickly that it seemed insignificant. Taehyung's phone buzzed with a notification. He picked it up, reading the emergency alert about potential earthquake tremors. His heart skipped a beat, but he tried to brush it off. It's probably nothing, he muttered, standing up to look out the window. The sky was darkening, but everything seemed calm outside. Ryan nodded, though her eyes were wary. Yeah, probably. But then, a few minutes later, the ground beneath them shook again, this time harder, more violently. The building groaned in protest and the lights flickered. Taehyung grabbed the edge of the sofa, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a tremor. Ryan's voice was small, filled with fear. Before he could respond, the shaking intensified, the walls shuddered, and the sound of glass breaking echoed through the apartment as picture frames and vases fell from their shelves. The ceiling above them creaked ominously, and Taehyung's eyes widened in horror as cracks began to spiderweb across the walls. Quiet, get up, he shouted, rushing towards her as the floor beneath them seemed to shift and sway. They scrambled towards the door, their panic rising with every second. The building was falling apart around them. As Taehyung flung open the apartment door, they were greeted by chaos. People running down the hallway screaming, trying to escape as pieces of ceiling crumbled and fell. The building swayed again, and Taehyung reached out to steady Vian as she stumbled. We need to get out of here, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Just as they stepped into the hallway, Vian's eyes widened in horror. Taehyung, look, she pointed towards down the corridor where a young child was trapped under a fallen cupboard, crying out for help. Without a second thought, Wine broke away from Taehyung and rushed towards the child. The cupboard was heavy, and the child was pinned beneath it, tears streaming down his face. Wine crashed down, trying to lift the cupboard off him. It's okay, I'm here, I'm going to get you out, she reassured the child, though her own voice shook with fear. Taehyung moved to help her, but just as he reached her side, he froze. Across the hallway, emerging from a neighboring apartment, was his ex. She was holding her phone in one hand, the other resting protectively around her rounded belly, her face pale with fear. The moment their eyes met, both of them froze. It felt like the world had stopped for a moment, like time had slowed down, and all the destruction around them faded into the background. Taehyung stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest as she stayed back, just as shocked. Taehyung, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. For a second, he didn't know what to do. The memories of their first time together flooded his mind. The love they had shared, the pain of losing her, and now here she was standing before him, pregnant with another man's child. Wan's voice snapped him back to reality. Taehyung, help me. He tore his gaze away from his ex and turned back to Ryan, who was struggling to lift the cupboard off the child. With a grunt, Taehyung rushed to her side and helped push the heavy furniture off the boy. They managed to free him, and Ryan quickly scooped him into her arms, cradling him close. We need to get out of here now, Ryan shouted, her eyes wide with panic. Taehyung nodded, his mind still reeling from his ex, but there was no time to dwell on it now. They needed to escape. They made their way down the hallway, dodging falling debris and stepping over cracks in the floor. The building was deteriorating rapidly, the walls crumbling and the ceiling collapsing in places. The noise was deafening, the sound of concrete grinding against concrete as the entire structure threatened to come down. When they reached the staircase, they were met with a terrifying sight. The stairs had collapsed, leaving only a gaping hole where the steps had once been. Taehyung cursed under his breath, his heart racing. The elevator whine shouted, her voice trembling. It's the only way down now. Taehyung's stomach churned at the thought. Taking the elevator during an earthquake was dangerous, but they didn't have a choice. There was no other way down, and the building was falling apart too quickly to wait for a safer option. He glanced back, and his eyes met his ex's again. She was standing a few feet away, her eyes filled with fear, clutching her belly protectively. For a split second, everything hung in the balance, his past, his present, and the crumbling building around them. But there was no time to hesitate. Let's go, he shouted, grabbing Ryan's hand as they ran towards the elevator, the child still in her arms. Behind them, his ex followed, and as they reached the elevator, Taehyung pressed the button frantically, praying that it would still work. The second dragged on, the sound of destruction growing louder, but then, with a loud ding, the elevator doors slid open. They rushed inside, huddling together as the doors were about to be closed. Taehyung glanced back, his heart pounding as his eyes met his ex's again. She was trying to make her way towards the elevator, but before she could reach it, another violent shake rocked the building. The floor trembled beneath her, and she lost her balance, falling hard onto the cracked tiles. Without thinking, Taehyung's instinct took over. He bolted towards her, the panic in his chest mounting as he saw her struggling to get back up. Wyan yelled after him, running behind out of the elevator. The building groaned under the strain, and dust filled in the air. More debris fell from the ceiling. He reached her just as she tried to push herself up. Are you okay? He asked, his voice thick with urgency, his hand reaching out to steady her. She nodded, but her face was pale, her hand protectively cradling her belly. I think so, but the baby. Taehyung didn't wait for her to finish. He pulled her up, wrapping his arm around her waist for support as they hurried back towards the elevator. Every second counted. The building could collapse at any moment, and he knew they had no time to waste. The elevator dinged as the doors split open, revealing a packed, terrified group of people crammed inside. Desperate to escape, Taehyung and his ex squeezed in with them, the small space filled with the smell of fear and sweat. The elevator lurched downward, stopping abruptly at the second floor. The sudden halt caused everyone inside to stumble, and a collective gasp filled the small space. We have to get out, someone yelled, panic rising as the doors opened halfway. People began shoving and pushing their way toward the stair, desperate to escape before the building came down. Taehyung struggled to keep hold of his ex, making sure she didn't fall again. But the pressure of bodies was overwhelming. The air was thick with panic. Every second felt like countdown to disaster. He managed to guide his ex out of the elevator and onto the second floor landing, but just as he stepped out, he turned to look back at Ryan. His breath stopped when she was nowhere to be found. Hey you guys, this is it for the part 1. The part 2 will be out tomorrow or maybe day after tomorrow. Whenever I'll be done with that. Anyways, follow me on Instagram. If you enjoyed, like, share, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think would happen next. Will Taehyung be able to save Ryan or will he be too late to do so? Do comment whatever you think would happen, and I will see you in the next part of it. Till then, bye bye.